Hey there, I'm Keenan Fry, and this is the acid drip. So right now, what I'm holding in my hand are some sheets of Arch's hot press paper. I got a commission from a guy named Jeff, who's in this band called Aspen Way, to do a t-shirt design. It was my first legit commission to do t-shirt design. I was pretty excited to get the commission. It felt like, a legitimate step forward for me. So I want to talk about like the process of developing the t-shirt and where I'm at now with it, and show you guys like what I learned along the way. And what I was trying to do was reference a Roger Dean piece. Just to be honest with you, his work is some of the best work I've ever seen in my life. I wanted to emulate Roger Dean because the client had this kind of dream where he saw this giant tower of flesh and eyes, and it was like coming out of the mountains, and the tower was twisting upwards into this like vortex. The main question I asked him, the most important question I think I asked him for context was, if you saw this tower in real life, would you feel a sense of foreboding or a sense of beckoning? He said it was a beckoning tower, a tower of light. That's where I got the idea for Roger Dean as a reference. I was basically between one of two places. Either Dan Seagrave, who did like, Suffocation's Effigy of the Forgotten and like Decrepit Birth and all of that, where it's all like sci-fi, twisted perspective. There's Dan Seagrave and then Roger Dean, right? In my opinion, those are the big two. Those are the two, right? They both make landscapes, but they fit different ends of the dynamic. So now what you're going to see are some Roger Dean pictures that inspired me, that I was starting to look at. And the main inspiration for me was Lake Tahoe. So what I wanted to do was make it look like this place was real. I wanted it to look like, if you saw this, it looked like a place that could actually exist. But it's this huge, huge effigy that's like way up in the air, and it's like very far away and distant from the viewer, but it is a place that looks like it could exist. And the trick is 3-point perspective. So what you're looking at here is, this ended up being the final template. But I have these sheets kind of laid out on the ground because they're pretty large, and I want to kind of give you an idea of how many of these I went through. But I also wanted to compare like what became the actual final concept, and how inefficient my initial process was. So for starters, I think this was right here my third draft. I had done a couple others before. Yeah, this one was one of the initial drafts. This was probably the first legit draft that I did. I thought about making the tower a large sort of object in a very small caldera. So like Crater Lake is a caldera that is, so like when the volcano erupts, part of the process is that it collapses on itself and it creates this giant bowl, and then rainwater collects in there. And that's kind of how Crater Lake formed, and that's how Lake Tahoe formed, is rainwater and runoff water from the local mountains collect in this natural bowl. It's an amazing thing to see because it really changes your perspective, because I think people are so used to driving through Tahoe, at least I am. I don't really see it in the same sort of distant third-person perspective where it's this elevated bowl of water, and it's a really great reference for this project, and that's kind of where the caldera idea came out of. But here the caldera is really small. It's like a very narrow, tall volcano, and I didn't really like that. I wanted it to look huge. So I kind of took a step back and worked on it a bit differently. And I think this one was the one where I started to really get the sense of scope that I was looking for. And so the first draft I was trying to create guidelines and dial in perspective. This one I kind of felt my way through it. And so like this area right here was where the original waterfall was going to be. And I had like this idea for a cave, and a bridge going to this small little like standing out rock, and then a rope bridge going over to the mountains that form the caldera. And I thought like, okay, you know, this is like this trail that these travelers are going to cross to get to the actual location. And then I had the idea for the tower being way out here, and like the mountains being about that big at their largest, which I'd say is maybe 1.25 inches, and then the largest mountain in the front being, I'd say, about maybe 2.5, not quite 3 inches. So I was kind of like thinking about the planes and the scale differences, and I started to get the scope of the idea. Also, this is where I came up with the idea to have the island in the middle. So this is kind of like the full length of the island, and then that's kind of like the height of what would have been the mountain, and then kind of spiraling out of it would have been the tower. I put, you know, probably 20 hours into this draft, because after I initially drew it, I then started dialing in perspective lines, which are what these guides are. And then that's when I realized, like, okay, I got to start over again because it's not really there. So my idea was like each time I dialed it in, I would start over by tracing it. But in order to trace it, I had to build this box to make sure that everything was square. So you can't just trace the box over again, because if that's the case and there's any inaccuracy, you're kind of stuck using just that draft to trace from. So what I wanted to do was render this side, and then on another draft render this side, because I was trying to, like, you know, I wanted to edit it as I go, because then I could, you know, use part of this one, but if there was a mountain or some shape I didn't like, when I decided to stop tracing it, I could start working on the next draft and start tracing this side and sort of like move into the middle and then kind of melt the two drafts into a revision. But that process didn't work out, and it was very time consuming to keep redrawing the guide boxes. It took me hours to just draw the guide boxes just to make sure that those were accurate, that this was, you know, 20 by 20, and that I had a set, you know, 20 by 12 in the middle. And then because I was setting the 20 by 12 in the middle, I didn't really have the ability to reframe things. So if I didn't like the focus of the piece, it was kind of just stuck where it was. That's why I thought, like, okay, maybe if I trace the drafts together, I can maybe play with what fits within the guides. So that was another reason to kind of like use the outer box to create the guides, because I felt like on the second draft I could move them around and change the focal point. Those two drafts came along, and then this one came along, and this is where I really started dialing into perspective, and I really got a sense for the 3-point perspective, because this was basically the furthest point forward from the back plane being this line going that way, being parallel to the bridge and this plane right here. And that's when I really started to see in my mind, like, this having its own shape, being its own entity, having a little standalone island in the middle, and then a bridge coming out from it. But even then, I was running into issues with figuring out how to bend the caldera, because in the final version that you see, this front focal point isn't here. The focal point is on the left side, not on the right. I didn't really have the ability to move things around the way I wanted to drafting. And as I went through more and more drafts, this was me trying to focus on, you know, the left side. This is where I got the idea that I really wanted the left side to be the front focal point. And so this is basically, this line is the edge of the 3-point perspective. This line right here is the forwardmost edge, and these are vanishing outwards. By drafting it, I was able to see it in my mind. You know, basically, it's basically this piece here, and then the rest of this kind of filled in. The problem I ran into was it just wasn't a very neat process. While trying to build the shapes and figure out how that was going to happen, I was always screwing up the paper so much that I knew I would not be able to use any of these drafts to paint on. None of these were going to be paintable because the paper would be so messed up and scratched up from erasing and drawing that it wasn't even usable. Basically what I did was I came to this sketch where, like, this is the loosest and lightest sketch, and ironically it's the last draft I did, and this is where I really just wanted to block out shapes. And the most important aspect of this was figuring out these lines here, because these are the perspective lines. Once I kind of knew where I wanted to place my perspective lines, and there's some really important measurements going on right here that are pretty small and hard to see, but that's where I was kind of like predicting where that focal point would be and where that one would be. That is the horizon line. This is the left vanishing point, and I didn't even have a big enough space on the paper to do the right vanishing point. So this is when I realized the inherent limitations of doing it on paper. And so I was really just sitting there thinking about it, really frustrated. And it took me like a month to go through this process, because I would work on it and, you know, set up the guidelines. Then I would work on it and build the initial shapes. And then I'd get frustrated and reach a stone wall. And then 2 or 3 days would pass and I wouldn't touch it, because I'd be looking at it and thinking about like what I ran into that was disrupting me and why it was disrupting me and what was wrong spatially with the depth perspective. I would spend time thinking about that, and then I would start the next draft. So this is like 4 weeks, 5 weeks into the process, I come up with this drawing, which is the most important drawing. So this drawing right here, and I'm gonna do a scan of it to make it a little bit, you know, easier for you guys to see. Geez, it's hard to line this up. How am I gonna do this? There we go. I'm gonna refocus for a second. You're gonna get a scan of this. But this guy right here was important because I came up with the side guides, I came up with the 3-point vanishing system, and I knew somewhere off in this distance would be the vanishing point on this side, somewhere off around here would be the vanishing point. I knew there would be a vanishing plane here, and that the front plane would vanish into this line, but would be further forward. That's why this bridge kind of extends indefinitely, because I wasn't sure how far forward I wanted the little island to connect to here, and then the bridge going to the right to connect to the cave. And then of course this even has problems because the back mountains, which are here, these back mountains are bigger than the front mountains, and so the stuff in the foreground is smaller than the stuff in the background, and that doesn't make sense because the stuff in the background is supposed to be smaller than the stuff in the foreground. So I had to like really restructure things and, you know, scale it differently, but this is when I really like saw what it is I was trying to make. So yeah, that's when I transitioned into doing the digital process.